The sun beat down on the polished rows of folding chairs, turning the stadium into a giant reflector oven. David Miller sat stiffly, a slightly out-of-place figure in a department store suit that was a size too large. Around him, families buzzed with celebratory energy, adjusting cameras and fussing with bouquets of flowers. His own hands were empty, clasped tightly in his lap. He hadn't expected to be here at all. The invitation, a formal email forwarded from his ex-wife, Susan, had sat in his inbox for a week. His daughter, Chloe's, university graduation. He'd RSVP'd no instantly. It was the right thing to do. His presence, he believed, would only be a shadow on her bright day. Their relationship was a fragile, distant thing, maintained through brief, awkward phone calls and the occasional birthday card. The years of silence, the missed school plays and soccer games, his fault, entirely, had built a wall he felt unworthy to scale. But, a week before the ceremony, a single, unexpected text had arrived from Chloe herself. Just 5 words. "I'd like it if you came." It wasn't an order, not even a plea. Just a quiet statement that had shattered his resolve. So he'd come. He'd driven 8 hours, booked a motel room that smelled of stale cigarettes, and bought the ill-fitting suit. His plan was simple: be a ghost. Watch her walk, see her smile from 100 yards away, and slip out before the crowd dispersed. He owed her that much visibility, at least. The procession began. Faculty in colorful robes, then the sea of black caps and gowns. His breath hitched when he spotted her. Chloe, his little girl, now a poised young woman with intelligent eyes, scanning the crowd. For a terrifying moment, he thought she was looking for him. He shrank back in his seat, the instinct of a man used to avoiding attention. He watched her take her seat, his heart a dull, aching drum in his chest. Settling in for the long speeches, David unconsciously rolled up his sleeves against the heat. On his left forearm, stark against his weathered skin, was the tattoo. A simple, elegant rendering of the Purple Heart Medal, with the dates of his deployment in Afghanistan inscribed below it. It was not a decoration he wore with pride, but a scar he bore in silence, a permanent reminder of a life, and a self he had left behind in the dust of a foreign mountain range. The tattoo was for him alone, a private penance, and he usually kept it covered. The speeches droned on. A senator, the university president, a valedictorian. David's mind drifted, not to the words, but to the past. The IED blast that wasn't loud, but a deep, crushing thump. The smell of burnt metal and earth. The silence after, then the screaming. The shrapnel that had torn through his leg and ended his career. The medal they'd given him felt like a consolation prize for a game he'd lost. He'd come home, but a part of him had stayed there, broken. It was that broken part that had cost him his family. The anger, the distance, the unbearable noise of civilian life that drove him to solitude. He'd pushed Susan away, convinced she and Chloe were better off without his darkness. A new speaker took the podium, introduced as the commencement's distinguished guest, retired General William Thorne. David paid little attention, focusing instead on the distant figure of Chloe in her sea of classmates. The general's voice was a crisp, authoritative baritone that carried easily across the stadium. He spoke of service, sacrifice, and the courage to build a future. Standard fare, David thought, tuning it out. Then, during a pause, it happened. General Thorne, gazing out at the audience, took a sip of water. His eyes, sharp and accustomed to detail, swept across the rows. They passed over David, then snapped back. The general's gaze fixed not on David's face, but on his exposed forearm, on the distinctive tattoo. The general's speech faltered for a microsecond, a barely noticeable skip in his rhythm that only someone versed in command pressure would detect. He finished his sentence, his eyes still locked on David from the distance. David, feeling the weight of the stare, looked up. For a brief, electric moment, the two men's eyes met across the crowded stadium. David saw not just recognition, but a deep, focused intensity in the general's face. It was the look of a man who had just spotted something critically important in a field of the ordinary. A cold trickle of unease ran down David's spine. He quickly pulled his sleeve down, breaking the connection. He told himself he was imagining it. He was just another face in the crowd. But the seed of unsettling awareness was planted. The ceremony continued, but, for David, The world had narrowed to the podium and the man upon it, who now seemed to be speaking directly to him, his earlier anonymity completely and irrevocably shattered. The ceremony concluded in a roaring, cap-tossing celebration. David stood with the crowd, a solitary island in a joyful sea. He kept his eyes on Chloe, watching as she hugged friends, her face radiant. This was her moment, and he had witnessed it. His mission, in his mind, was complete. The encounter with the general's gaze was just a strange blip, a moment of paranoid fantasy. He began to weave through the throng, head down, aiming for the nearest exit. The plan was in motion. He'd send Chloe a text later. Proud of you. Had to leave. Love, Dad. It was cowardly, but clean. David Miller? The voice cut through the celebratory noise, firm and unmistakably directed at him. David froze, his blood turning to ice. He turned slowly. Standing before him was not the general himself, but a young man in a sharp, military-adjacent suit. He had the posture of a soldier and a polite but unyielding expression. Mr. Miller, sir. General Thorne requests a moment of your time. David's mind raced. There must be a mistake, he said, his voice rough from disuse. I don't know any general. He saw your tattoo, sir. The Purple Heart. The aide's tone left no room for debate. He's waiting just over here. It will only take a minute. Panic and a lifetime of avoiding authority warred within him. He glanced desperately toward where he'd last seen Chloe, but she was lost in the crowd. Making a scene was unthinkable. It would draw attention, her attention, and ruin everything. Gritting his teeth, he gave a curt nod and followed the aide to a shaded area near the administrative buildings. General Thorne stood there, having changed from his academic robe into a crisp summer service uniform. Up close, he was an imposing figure, his hair steel gray, his eyes a piercing blue that missed nothing. But his expression, David noted with confusion, wasn't one of stern authority. It was one of profound, almost solemn respect. Sergeant Miller, the general said, extending his hand. Not Mr. Sergeant. The use of his old rank hit David like a physical blow. He shook the hand automatically, his own grip calloused and tentative. Just David, sir. I'm not, that was a long time ago. The service is never a long time ago, Sergeant. Not for men like us. The general released his hand, his gaze dropping briefly to David's covered forearm. 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. Sanjan District, 2011. David flinched. The general had not only recognized the medal, he'd identified his unit and his tour from the tattoo's design. Details only another Marine would know. How did you? I was the regimental commander for that sector in 11. General Thorne said, his voice dropping. I remember the after-action report for the IED strike on your patrol. 2 men lost. 3, including your team leader, Sergeant Vasquez, and you, severely wounded. He said the names with the weight of personal memory. You dragged Vasquez 50 yards to cover while your leg was shredded. They said you refused the medevac until he was on the bird. David looked away, his jaw clenched. The memories, always just beneath the surface, surged forward with visceral clarity. The weight of Vasquez's body, the slickness of blood, the sound of his own ragged breathing. He didn't speak of it. Ever. You have a good memory, General. For some things I do. The general paused, studying David's face, seeing the years of quiet struggle etched there. I've read the citation for your medal. Your actions were textbook courage under fire. And then, you just disappeared. Left the hospital, declined further rehab musters, fell off the grid. I came home, David said flatly, a defensive wall slamming up. Did you? The general's question was quiet, not accusatory, but deeply insightful. He changed tack. What are you doing now, son? Nothing that matters, David muttered, the words tasting bitter. I fix trucks. I keep to myself. Before the general could respond, a new voice, bright and shocked, cut through the tension. Dad, David whirled around. Chloe stood a few feet away, her graduation gown flowing, her cap in her hand. Her eyes were wide, flicking from his face to the decorated general standing with him in clear, intense conversation. Confusion, curiosity, and a hint of hurt were all at war on her face. What's going on? Who is this? David's world imploded. This was the exact scenario he had sought to avoid for a decade. His 2 shattered worlds, the broken veteran and the failed father, were colliding in front of the one person he most wanted to shield. He was exposed, and he had no idea how to explain the decorated general who knew the darkest chapter of his life. A suffocating silence hung between the three of them. David felt like a specimen under a microscope, pinned by the curious gaze of his daughter and the knowing eyes of the general. General Thorne, with a diplomat's instinct, broke the stalemate. He stepped forward, his demeanor shifting from intense commander to gracious gentleman. "You must be Chloe," he said, offering a warm smile. "Congratulations. Your father was just telling me how incredibly proud he is of you." The lie, delivered with such effortless conviction, momentarily disarmed Chloe. She shook his extended hand, her confusion deepening. "Thank you, sir. I'm sorry, but do you know my dad? Our paths crossed a long time ago, in service to the country," the general said smoothly, omitting the painful details. "I spotted an old comrade, and wanted to pay my respects." He turned his piercing blue eyes back to David, and, in them, David saw a silent command, an order from a superior officer. "Step up." Now, the instinct to obey, buried for years, stirred. He cleared his throat, the sound like gravel. "Chloe, this is General Thorne. He was in charge of the area where I served." He couldn't bring himself to say more. "It's an honor to meet the daughter of a true hero," the general said, laying it on thick, but with a sincerity that was undeniable. Chloe's eyes widened. "Hero." She looked at her father, seeing the slumped shoulders, the ill-fitting suit, the man who had always been a vague, disappointing absence. The words seemed to hang in the air, incompatible with the reality she knew. David wanted the earth to swallow him. "The general is being polite," he mumbled. "Nonsense," Thorne boomed, clapping a hand on David's shoulder. The gesture was firm, anchoring. "Modesty is a virtue, Sergeant, but so is giving your family the truth." He turned his attention fully to Chloe. "Your father performed an act of extraordinary bravery to save his fellow Marines. He earned one of our nation's highest awards for it. I was just telling him that his country, and his old comrades, have not forgotten." Chloe was speechless, looking at her father as if seeing him for the first time. The narrative of her life, a father who left because he didn't care, was suddenly cracking, revealing a hidden, terrifying history beneath. Seeing her struggle, the general made a decision. "You know," he said, his tone becoming conversational, "the university president is hosting a small reception for the platform party and distinguished guests at the faculty club. It's just over the lawn." He looked directly at David. "Sergeant, I would consider it a personal honor if you and your daughter would join me as my guests." It was an outrageous suggestion. David, in his cheap suit, at a university president's reception? He opened his mouth to refuse, to flee. But Chloe spoke first. Her voice was small, but firm. "I'd like that," she said. She wasn't looking at the general. She was staring at David, her eyes a storm of hurt and a desperate, newfound need to understand. "Dad, please." That please was a weapon against which he had no defense. It was the plea he'd imagined for years, but never heard. The general's invitation was an order, but Chloe's was a summons from the heart he thought he'd closed off. He saw in her face not just a graduate, but the little girl whose bedtime stories he'd stopped telling. The wall he'd built began to crumble. He gave a single, stiff nod. "Okay." The walk to the elegant, ivy-clad faculty club was the longest of David's life. He walked beside Chloe in silence, with the general a tactful half-step ahead, giving them a semblance of privacy. He could feel the questions radiating from her, but she didn't ask them. Not yet. The reception was a world of polished silver, delicate china, and the low hum of academic and military prestige. David felt more out of place than ever. But General Thorne was a force of nature. He introduced David not as Chloe's father, but as Sergeant David Miller, one of my 2-7 heroes from Sanjin. Suddenly, colonels, professors, and the university president himself were shaking David's hand, their expressions respectful, thanking him for his service. David was drowning in a past he'd tried to bury. Each handshake, each mention of your sacrifice, felt like a shovel of dirt being thrown back onto a grave he was trying to crawl out of. He answered in monosyllables, his gaze constantly darting to Chloe, who watched it all with an unreadable expression. He was no longer a ghost. He was a centerpiece, and the spotlight was burning him alive, exposing every crack and every scar he'd spent a lifetime hiding. The reception swirled around David, a dizzying carousel of polite faces and echoing accolades. He stood by a tall window, an untouched glass of water in his hand, a silent statue in the moving crowd. General Thorne had been pulled into a conversation with the university president, but his eyes occasionally found David's, a steady, watchful presence. Chloe approached him slowly, holding a small plate of cake she wasn't eating. The noise of the room seemed to fade into a muffled hum around them. "You never told me," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of immense, bewildering fact. David stared out at the manicured lawn, the scene of his recent anonymity. There was nothing to tell, he lied, the old reflex automatic. Nothing to tell. Her composure finally cracked, a fissure of years of pent-up hurt. A Purple Heart? A general who knows your name, and you're your battalion? You saving people? That's nothing. She took a shaky breath. All my life, Mom just said you had trouble coming home, that you were different after the war. I thought it was an excuse. I thought you just didn't want us. Each word was a shard of glass in his heart. He finally turned to look at her, really look at her, and saw the young woman she'd become, shaped in part by the empty space he'd left. The weight of his silence, his chosen burden, now felt like a crime against her. I didn't want you, he said, the brutal honesty shocking them both. He hurried to clarify, his voice breaking. Not like that. I came back, broken, Chloe. In here. He tapped his temple, then his chest. And in here. The world was too loud, too bright. I was angry all the time, or I was nothing at all. A hollow man. He looked down at his hands, the hands that had dragged a brother to safety, and then failed to hold on to his family. You and your mother. You were the only good, pure things in my life. And I was poison. I left because I loved you too much to let my darkness touch you. I thought my absence was the only gift I had left to give. Tears welled in Chloe's eyes, but they were not just tears of sadness. They were tears of dawning, painful understanding. The story was rearranging itself. The villain was not a man who didn't care, but a man who cared so destructively he chose exile. That was never your choice to make, she said, her voice stronger now. We needed you. Broken or not, we would have figured it out with you. Her words, simple and true, dismantled the core justification of his entire adult life. He had no defense. He just nodded, a slow, weary surrender. I know that now. I'm so sorry, Chloe. For all of it. General Thorne chose that moment to rejoin them, his timing impeccable. He assessed the raw emotion on their faces with a commander's quick eyes and a father's empathy. Sergeant, he said, his tone formal yet kind. A word before you go. He led David a few steps aside, leaving Chloe to collect herself. You're planning on running again, the general stated, not asking. David couldn't deny it. The exposure was terrifying. Don't, Thorne said, the single word carrying the weight of an order. That young woman over there just got a glimpse of her father for the first time. The real one. The warrior. Don't you dare take that away from her again. He leaned in slightly. The VA has a new program for men from our era. Proper outreach, proper counseling. Not the old system. I'm on the board. Let me give you a name. A phone number. Not an order. A bridge back. He pressed a crisp business card into David's hand. David looked at it, then at the general's face, and saw no pity, only a steadfast belief in a fellow soldier's ability to heal. For the first time in years, the idea of help didn't feel like an admission of permanent defeat. It felt like a possible, if distant, objective. The general then turned to Chloe. Miss Miller, he said, with a formality that honored her. Your father is one of the bravest men I've ever had the privilege to serve with. That kind of courage doesn't disappear. It just sometimes gets lost. I believe he just found his way back to his most important post. He gave a slight, respectful nod to them both and melted back into the crowd. His mission, it seemed, accomplished. The drive back to Chloe's apartment was quiet, but the silence was different now. It wasn't empty. It was full of unspoken words and the fragile beginnings of a new understanding. At her door, she hesitated. Will you come in? She asked. Just for a coffee. You don't have to drive back tonight. David looked at her, at the open door, at the life he had been too afraid to be part of. He thought of the card in his pocket, the general's words, and the decades of self-imposed solitude. He thought of the tattoo on his arm, not just as a mark of a wound received, but of survival, and, perhaps, of a duty not yet finished. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Coffee sounds good." He didn't cross the threshold as a hero, or even as a fully whole man. He crossed it simply as a father, finally, coming home, ready to begin the long, hard work of building a peace more lasting than any he had ever known in war. The ceremony had ended hours ago, but, for David Miller, his real graduation into a life of connection, however painful, had just begun.